So far, we've been studying the three levels of international relations. The top level, the international system. The second level, the state. And the third level today, I want to talk about individuals and whether or not they matter. So the first question then becomes, do individuals matter? And like most things, the answer to this question depends on which theorists you prefer. If you're in the liberal camp, you say that yes, individuals do matter. State actions depend on their leaders. For example, Nicolae Ceausescu, the dictator of Romania for 22 years, displayed a number of different changes over the course of his lifetime. He tended to act independently of the USSR, recognizing West Germany, siding with Israel, and in general, if you were to chart his progress through time, his ideas would change while the actions of his state also changed. Mikhail Gorbachev, leader of the Soviet Union in the 1980s, questioned the efficiency of the Soviet economy and the wisdom of fighting a war in Afghanistan. He also instigated economic reform in the USSR. If you're a constructivist, you say yes, individuals do matter. Not just the leaders, but also the other people who make up state power, bureaucrats, cultural elites, and advisors to the leaders. If you're a realist and a radical, you probably tend to downplay the importance of individuals. You find more use in looking at systems and states. Leaders will make the same choices because ultimately they face the same constraints and have the same interests. So the questions that we want to ask ourselves today are, number one, when do the actions of individuals have an effect on the course of events? And number two, under what circumstances will different actors make different choices? First part of this, when do individuals matter the most? Number one, when political institutions are young or unstable. Think of the American founders having a profound effect on the later United States. Think of Mohandas Gandhi and his effect on India, or Lenin and Trotsky and their effect on the Soviet Union. These were individuals who were allowed to create precedents. Think about Washington retiring after 2 terms as president, leading every president except one to do the same thing. Instability also calls for new ideas and practices. Think about the Great Depression during the 1930s, when FDR created the social welfare state in the United States. Adolf Hitler militarized Germany. The United States and Germany were both unstable places, and new ideas and practices were used by their elites. 2. When do individuals matter the most? When institutional constraints matter very little. Dictators are important, the most influential leaders there are, because they have absolute freedom of power. In our system in the United States, our Constitution restricts our leaders much more. Congress lately hasn't been interested in exercising its power to declare war, because it's really hard. Therefore, presidents in the United States are largely free to behave however they like in terms of national security. Imagine George W. Bush fighting the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, the drone tactics of President Obama, Guantanamo Bay, the Patriot Act, etc. Without those institutional constraints that our Constitution builds into the system in theory, our presidents in the last 50 years have largely done whatever they wanted. Number three, when do individuals matter the most? When the situation is unusual or ambiguous. Regular situations build a culture of SOPs, or standard operating procedures. But in a crisis scenario that you've never faced before, with limited information and no precedents to go on, you sort of have to make things up as you go. John Kennedy, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, paid attention to the dynamics of his group and the new options that he had because the United States had never before faced a crisis as big as what was going on with the missiles of the Soviet Union and Cuba. Finally, number 4, when do individuals that matter the most? Their personality always tends to affect things. Margaret Herman was a political psychologist. She studied 80 leaders of 38 states, and she analyzed into 2 different types of leaders by their broad psychology. She said there are 2 types of leaders in the world. The first kind are driven. They tend to be nationalist, patriotic, confident in their own importance, ambitious, and distrustful of others. And those leaders tend to be very active when dealing with other countries. The second kind of leader is a participatory leader. These people are trusting. They're not nationalistic, and they very much are not impressed by their own importance. They tend to join groups. They tend to make coalitions. Betty Glad, another political psychologist, analyzed President Jimmy Carter during the 1979 hostage crisis. 1979, Iran revolutionaries captured 60 U.S. embassy workers and held them for a year plus. If you've ever seen the movie Argo, that's what this was about. Glad's analysis said that Carter made the hostage-taking personal, that he became obsessed. He turned a political event into an emotional attack on the United States, and he gave Iran a much bigger hold on the nation's power and influence than if he had handled it in secret. This ultimately would lead to the downfall of the Carter presidency, the fact that he made it personal, and then he lost. The third big topic that I want to talk about today are how individuals make choices. Decision-making is what we call this. How do you look at choices and determine which one to do? Ideally, most people would say that they are rational, that they examine all of their choices and determine the best one for the lowest cost. But the rational model of decision-making requires a lot of assumptions. Number one, that individuals possess all relevant information. Number two, that individuals can identify all goals and select the most desirable ones. Number three, that you can rationally examine all available choices. And number four, that you accurately make the best decision. In the normal course of events, possessing all of these assumptions and information is very rare. Usually you have to work with imperfect or incomplete information. We don't really know whether or not Russia has yet invaded the Crimea. We've seen masked men carrying guns in Ukraine, but we don't know if they're Russian or not. Often you're overwhelmed by a plethora of choices. Should we invade the Ukraine? Should we call for economic sanctions? Should we use drone warfare? Should we put boots on the ground? You can also evaluate how choices are made in this situation in order to make a better choice. So there are a number of ways that people use to make choices that aren't necessarily rational, and the first is to use belief systems. These are existing perceptions and prior beliefs, prejudices, if you will, used as a screen for new knowledge. These provide guidance and planning for new situations. In the 1950s, the Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, saw the USSR in a constant context. He saw the Soviet people as good, but their leadership as bad. And throughout the 1950s, no matter what the situation was, he still made decisions as if the Soviet people had been taken over by evil leaders. The second type of decision-making that's not necessarily rational is what we call information processing. The idea that belief systems rarely change, and that your brain needs a system to process new information. Cognitive consistency is the first kind of information processing. In this plan, the brain accepts information that is consistent with previous thoughts and information. Any inconsistent information is ignored. The United States in the 1980s didn't believe that a peaceful ally, Great Britain, would attack another, in theory, peaceful ally, the country of Argentina, over the Falkland Islands. They were incorrect. The second information processing technique is what's called the evoked set. When you use the evoked set, you look for details that are similar to past experiences. You use analogies to make sense of new information. The danger here is that misconstruing a situation based on a bad analogy. For the last 60 years, the United States has assumed that every war is just like World War II, except it isn't. We assume that Vietnam was the same as Korea, which it wasn't. We assume that Iraq was the same as Vietnam, which it wasn't. We assume that Afghanistan was the same as Nazi Germany, and it wasn't. Then we assumed that Iraq was like Iraq the first time we went in there, and it also wasn't. So analogies can be a useful tool, but be careful of using bad ones that lead you to false conclusions. The third type of information processing technique that your brain uses is what's called a mirror image. And when your brain does this, you identify what your own traits are, and then because somebody else is your opponent, you project those traits onto them. Most of us would probably agree that the United States is a good country, and therefore we would be led to the mirror image that Russia is a bad country. We love freedom, therefore they must hate freedom. If you satisfice, that means you have found a good enough solution instead of an optimal solution. In 1999, President Bill Clinton was faced with ethnic cleansing in Eastern Europe and chose to use the Air Force against the Kosovar army. In 2011, President Obama made the same decision in that country to only use air forces. Both presidents had found a good enough solution instead of an optimal solution. In both cases, violence continued despite United States air power. The last technique that your brain uses to make sense of things is what's called groupthink. In this case, small groups will form a consensus, and then no matter what that consensus is, defend it bitterly. Any outside information that might change or improve their ideas is rejected because that information came from outside the group. In the 1960s, President Johnson ran a Tuesday lunch group, a group of high-level Vietnam advisors, and they became unwilling to look at Viet Cong military buildup or evaluate the increasing number of United States casualties because that information was coming from outside their small group. So, what we've looked at so far is whether or not individuals matter when we talk about global politics. We've thought mostly so far about leaders, presidents, prime ministers, etc. But I want to talk about other individuals that are important on the world stage, among them private individuals, people without any official role in government, but who nonetheless function as global actors. In this case, it's useful to talk about two-track diplomacy, the idea that private individuals can work for conflict resolution in the world. Neither person is affiliated with a state government, which means they have no constraints on their power, but they aren't necessarily elected by anybody. During the Cold War, American businessman, and this is his real name, Armand Hammer, was named after the symbol of socialism, right, the sickle and hammer, had a number of business contacts in the United States and in the Soviet Union. He worked as a go-between for the White House and the Kremlin when they wanted to talk to each other, but couldn't because of popular constraints. It was Armand Hammer, by the way, who convinced Russia to allow United States aid after the nuclear disaster at Chernobyl. In the 1990s, Texas businessman Ross Perot used his money to help Vietnam POWs. He later ran for president on an economic platform of preventing globalization. He said if we lower constraints to trade, will result in just shipping all of our jobs overseas. Private individuals can also function through informal actions. During the Cold War, West German stunt pilot Matthias Rust landed a plane in Moscow's Red Square. He intended it as a prank, but the West realized that the Soviet Union was not a military fortress, that it could in fact be infiltrated. During the Vietnam War, actress Jane Fonda visited North Vietnam. Olympic athletes often defect during international competitions. This happened in 2012. Finally, financiers, money guys, like George Soros, often work for democracy in former Soviet Union states. The last thing we should note about private individuals is the importance of their actions to postmodernists. Postmodernists stress the importance of marginalized individuals as historical political actors. Think about the way that we used to think about United States history as a sequence of what dead white men did, and then many people realized that the country was made up of people who weren't dead, white, and male. Studying individuals like those, especially the ones who are not traditionally powerful, has told us a fuller story of what's happened in our own past and future. Lastly, and we'll talk about this more tomorrow, the influence of mass publics. Instead of one individual, a group of people. What we call fractal biology, the idea that groups share the same qualities that individuals possess. Groups can process information. Groups can hold prejudices. Groups use mirror images. They believe the United States is strong and that Iran, therefore, is weak and evil. Individuals or groups protect territory that belongs to them. Russia protects itself against Germany, but the United Kingdom also protected itself against the Argentinians in the Falkland Islands in the 1980s. Mass publics also hold strong public opinions that can be measured statistically and are available publicly. Groups can express their opinions about politics and cause elites to alter their decisions. Lyndon Johnson in 1968 didn't run for re-election because the mass public opinion of the United States told him that he wouldn't win. George W. Bush invaded Iraq after September 11th, even though most of the hijackers of the planes were from Saudi Arabia, and they found haven in the country of Afghanistan, and there was no link between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda, because American popular opinion allowed him to. Rarely, the public gets to vote on foreign policy issues directly. In 1992, the Maastricht Treaty, which created the European Union, was ratified by Europeans popularly. More commonly, most citizens of modern democracies get to vote for whoever is closest to their own ideas between two or more options.